In the final winter months of the war, German soldiers found themselves fighting a losing battle across broken landscapes, muddy fields, and shattered towns. Their supply lines were collapsing, their armored divisions were thinning out, and the once-feared war machine of the Third Reich was losing the mobility it relied on during the early Blitzkrieg days. In this chaos, one vehicle repeatedly stunned them, not a tank, not a plane, not any giant piece of machinery, but a small, simple, almost toy-like American Jeep. German troops, officers, and even captured mechanics described it with genuine admiration, often saying they wished they had something similar. To them, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of the kind of mobility they desperately lacked. The Jeep's ability to keep moving in conditions where German vehicles sank, stalled, or simply broke down made it seem almost supernatural. While their own motorcycles toppled in mud, and armored cars got stuck in forests, the Jeep glided through with a strange ease that felt unfair on the battlefield. The first time many German patrols encountered a Jeep, they mistook it for a civilian car. It was small, unarmored, and looked harmless. But as they observed it more closely, they realized it moved with a level of freedom no German vehicle could match. It could climb slopes, cross fields, navigate tight village paths, and slip through forest routes that German Kübelwagen struggled with. German officers noted in reports that American commanders could relocate messages, weapons, scouts, and officers with a speed that felt impossible. A Jeep could take wounded soldiers out of heavy fire, carry ammunition to front lines in minutes, and act as an eyes and ears platform for advancing units. For German troops stuck with heavier, more delicate vehicles, this mobility felt like the Allies possessed a secret advantage. The Jeep was simple, but in that simplicity was a power they underestimated until it was too late. One of the biggest shocks to German mechanics came the first time they inspected a captured Jeep. They expected a complicated machine with unique American technology. Instead, they found the opposite, a rugged engine, simple wiring, strong suspension, and clever design choices that made repairs unbelievably easy. German vehicles, especially late-war models, required precision parts and careful handling. A minor issue could take hours to fix. But a Jeep? A lone mechanic with a basic toolkit could repair it in the field. Its parts were interchangeable, its components were accessible, and its design followed a clear purpose: stay running, no matter what. German reports often complained that American logistics were unfairly efficient, because nearly every part fit nearly every Jeep. If one was broken, it became a donor for another. German equipment, with all its engineering brilliance, lacked this field simplicity. Even more striking to German soldiers was how the Jeep behaved like a multi-purpose battlefield tool. They saw them used as reconnaissance vehicles, ambulance carriers, mobile command posts, machine gun platforms, radio stations, and supply carriers. A single Jeep could perform tasks that would require multiple German vehicles, each designed for highly specific roles. The adaptability confused German planners. They were used to rigid classifications: scout car, command car, motorcycle, half-track, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. The Jeep ignored these categories. It became whatever the Allies needed it to be. German troops complained that the Americans seemed to have thousands of tiny ghosts, moving supplies, messages, and soldiers everywhere at once. One of the most demoralizing experiences came when Germans retreated through muddy or snow-choked environments. Their vehicles bogged down quickly, especially as fuel shortages forced them to use whatever low-quality gasoline they could find. Meanwhile, Jeeps flew past them, bouncing over terrain that should have been impassable. It wasn't that the Jeep was powerful, it was the opposite. It was light, balanced, and flexible. German soldiers recalled that the harder the terrain became, the more unstoppable the Jeep seemed. In thick forests during the Battle of the Bulge, German armor struggled to maneuver, but Jeeps squeezed through narrow frozen paths and continued supplying American lines. This mobility shocked German commanders, who realized that the Jeep allowed rapid reinforcement in areas they believed were completely blocked. Another aspect that impressed German troops was how fearlessly American soldiers used the Jeep. They drove it close to enemy lines, through artillery fire, across mine-ridden fields, and into bombed towns with remarkable confidence. To German eyes, it looked reckless. To the Americans, it was simply normal. They trusted the Jeep because it rarely failed them. A vehicle with no armor, no heavy weaponry, and barely any shielding became a frontline companion. Germans respected that loyalty. Some even said Americans treated the Jeep like a soldier, something they relied on, cared for, and worked alongside. It became part of their war identity. This bond between man and machine fascinated German officers, who believed such morale-boosting equipment played a silent role in Allied success. The psychological impact was undeniable. German troops admired American tanks and planes, but those machines were rare, loud, and massive. The Jeep, however, was everywhere. They saw it daily. They saw it succeed where their own vehicles failed. They saw it carrying soldiers who would soon be fighting them. That constant visibility created respect, sometimes even envy. Many captured German soldiers admitted that if they could choose any Allied vehicle for themselves, they'd pick the Jeep. Not a Sherman tank, not a P-51 Mustang, just this tiny four-wheeled miracle. It represented reliability at a time when everything around them was falling apart. As the war drew to an end, hundreds of German soldiers attempted to steal or commandeer Jeeps. Some used them to escape advancing Soviet forces. Others tried to bring one home as a trophy, a personal reminder of the machine they admired the most. In post-war interviews, German officers repeatedly highlighted the Jeep as one of the most effective Allied vehicles, not because of firepower or armor, but because of its unstoppable mobility, rugged simplicity, and unmatched reliability. In a war filled with giant weapons and massive machines, it was the smallest vehicle that earned the deepest respect. As the war intensified across Europe and North Africa, German soldiers repeatedly found themselves surprised by how the American Jeep kept showing up in impossible places. The terrain that the Allies were forced to fight through was unforgiving: deep mud, frozen roads, rocky hills, destroyed bridges, and narrow forest paths that should have stopped any vehicle. Yet time and time again, German scouts reported sightings of small American Jeeps maneuvering through areas they believed were completely impassable. For the Germans, who had been trained to rely heavily on carefully engineered but often delicate machinery, this kind of mobility felt almost unreal. They watched Jeeps climb slopes that made motorcycles slip, cross rivers shallow enough to splash through, and negotiate craters left by artillery fire. Even when the terrain changed suddenly, sand one moment, snow the next, the Jeep continued forward as if the environment simply didn't matter. In the North African desert, where even German trucks struggled in shifting sands, soldiers from the Afrika Korps recalled how the Jeep moved lightly across dunes and dry riverbeds. Its wide tires and low weight gave it an advantage that German vehicles often lacked. Kübelwagens performed well, but they didn't have the same raw agility or speed in tight turns or rough ground. The Jeep could dart from one ridge to another, making it the perfect tool for fast reconnaissance and surprise flanking movements. Germans described it as a desert fox, an ironic comparison, given Rommel's nickname, because of how quickly it appeared and disappeared across the horizon. In open desert warfare, where every advantage in speed mattered, seeing Allied forces use a tiny vehicle to outrun and outmaneuver larger German transports left a lasting impression. The same shock repeated itself in Europe, especially during the chaotic early months after D-Day. German soldiers who believed that the thick hedgerows of Normandy would slow the Allied advance were stunned to see Jeeps weaving through narrow farm paths, pushing through muddy orchards, and even forcing their way between broken stone walls. Some German defenders thought the Jeep would get stuck the moment it left the main road. Instead, it seemed to thrive in the small pathways between fields. It became a nightmare to track because it moved unpredictably, finding new routes where heavier vehicles could not follow. Many German after-action reports mentioned how the Allies used Jeeps to bypass choke points, flank defensive positions, and deliver messages faster than the Germans could react. Winter added another layer of confusion. Snow should have stopped open vehicles. But Jeeps, fitted with simple chains on their tires, kept climbing icy slopes and cutting through slush. During the Battle of the Bulge, German troops pushing through the Ardennes forests assumed the harsh cold would slow down the Americans. Instead, jeeps appeared along forest roads that even German half-tracks struggled with. Their low weight kept them from sinking, and their engines kept running in temperatures that caused German batteries to freeze. Some German soldiers joked that the jeep must have been blessed by the weather gods, because they couldn't understand how such a small, unprotected vehicle could keep functioning in the worst conditions. Another terrain type where the jeep shocked German forces was in river crossings. While it wasn't a boat or amphibious vehicle, it could splash through surprisingly deep water thanks to its high-mounted engine components and sealed electrical parts. Germans saw jeeps driving through shallow rivers, flooded roads, and destroyed bridges without hesitation. Many of their own vehicles stalled when water reached sensitive engine areas, but jeeps kept going. American engineers also used them to tow small, makeshift ferries, turning them into multipurpose river support vehicles. Germans watching from across riverbanks realized that the jeep removed natural obstacles the way larger Allied tanks crushed concrete, quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly. Forest fighting showcased yet another strength. The jeep's short turning radius allowed it to slip between trees where German armored cars simply couldn't go. In dense forests like Hurtgen, where even moving a platoon forward was a nightmare, jeeps became lifelines for American troops. They brought ammunition to positions that were unreachable by truck and evacuated wounded soldiers from areas German commanders believed were inaccessible. Germans later admitted that the jeep gave the Americans logistical mobility in forests that they themselves could not match. Every time they thought the terrain had isolated an American unit, a jeep would appear like a ghost, carrying supplies or fresh troops. Urban combat added an unexpected twist. Bombed-out cities turned into obstacle courses of rubble, broken streets, and collapsed buildings. German vehicles often got stuck or had to find alternative paths. Jeeps, on the other hand, hopped over debris, squeezed between ruins, and navigated alleys with astonishing agility. German snipers complained that jeep drivers were hard targets because they moved quickly and unpredictably through destroyed neighborhoods. The jeep's size made it perfect for slipping through the twisted remains of cities under siege, allowing it to support infantry in ways bulkier German vehicles simply couldn't. What confused German soldiers even more was how the jeep performed with a full load. They saw jeeps carrying radios, ammunition crates, extra fuel cans, sandbags, stretchers, and sometimes 6 or 7 soldiers hanging off the sides. Even overloaded, the jeep managed to move. German trucks often slowed down dramatically when carrying extra weight, especially in mud or soft ground. But the jeep's engine and suspension allowed it to carry surprising loads without becoming sluggish. German troops joked bitterly that the Americans must have put magic inside the engine, because nothing else made sense. All of these terrain advantages added up to one clear conclusion: the jeep was not just a vehicle, it was a universal key that unlocked every battlefield environment. Desert heat, European mud, mountain passes, forest trails, bombed cities, snowfields, river crossings, nothing seemed to stop it. German soldiers respected their own engineering, but they couldn't deny that the Americans had created something unique. They admired the jeep not because it was beautiful or advanced, but because it simply refused to fail. It moved where it shouldn't, survived conditions that broke other machines, and kept the American army moving forward faster than German commanders could counter. In a war where mobility often decided victory, the jeep proved that small, simple engineering could sometimes outsmart even the most complex machines. German soldiers were often struck by how the American jeep carried far more than its small frame suggested. At first glance, it looked like a light, simple vehicle meant only for quick transport, but once they observed it in action, they realized it functioned as a miniature logistics machine. The amount of ammunition, fuel, equipment, and medical supplies packed into its limited space impressed even the most seasoned German officers. They watched American units load jeeps with crates of .30 caliber rounds, rations, water cans, fuel drums, and radio gear, yet the vehicle kept moving without strain. German supply trucks often needed careful weight distribution and constant maintenance, especially on weak roads, but the jeep seemed indifferent to such concerns. Even overloaded, it accelerated smoothly, climbed hills without complaint, and handled rough terrain as if the extra cargo gave it more determination instead of slowing it down. German soldiers wondered how a vehicle so small could become the beating heart of Allied resupply efforts. The speed with which the Jeep delivered supplies left German troops even more bewildered. Supply lines in the Wehrmacht were famously efficient early in the war, but by 1944 and 1945, shortages, broken vehicles, and bombed rail networks made it increasingly difficult for them to move equipment. In contrast, Jeeps zipped along roads, forest paths, and even open fields to bring ammunition to the front faster than German units could expend it. They worked like flying messengers, carrying everything from machine gun belts to bazooka rounds, ensuring American infantry never ran short. Germans trapped in defensive positions often found that the Americans could keep firing longer simply because Jeeps never stopped delivering fresh supplies. Some German officers described the Jeep as a moving arsenal, a surprisingly accurate description of how it functioned in battle. For every German platoon struggling to ration bullets, there seemed to be an American Jeep delivering thousands more to their opponents. Beyond ammunition, the Jeep became a lifeline for wounded soldiers. German medical vehicles were larger, slower, and struggled tremendously on broken terrain. In contrast, Jeeps raced into dangerous areas under fire to evacuate the injured. They were often modified with stretchers mounted on the sides or across the rear, turning them into miniature ambulances that could reach places traditional medical trucks could not. German soldiers respected this bravery. Watching medics speed through artillery bursts or sniper zones in an unarmored Jeep left a deep impression. It was not just the machine they admired, but the confidence and speed with which the Americans used it. German stretcher-bearers had to carry the wounded long distances because their vehicles could not reach frontline areas. Meanwhile, Jeeps arrived, loaded the injured in seconds, and disappeared along narrow forest trails, saving lives that would have been lost to blood loss or exposure. This efficiency, driven by both the vehicle and the soldiers who operated it, frustrated German commanders who struggled to keep their own wounded alive. Another role that astonished German troops was how the Jeep served as a mobile command post. In many battles, they watched American officers use Jeeps as rolling headquarters, complete with radios, maps, and communication gear. Germans typically had to rely on bulky command vehicles or stationary positions, both of which were vulnerable to artillery and air attacks. But American commanders simply drove forward in their Jeeps, surveyed terrain in person, and issued direct orders while still on the move. This mobility allowed for faster decision-making, faster adaptation, and far better coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. German soldiers realized that the Jeep's presence on the battlefield wasn't just physical, it changed the speed at which the Americans could think and react. The Wehrmacht, once known for lightning-fast operations, suddenly found themselves being outmaneuvered by an army using tiny open vehicles as nerve centers. The Jeep also became a crucial communication tool. Its ability to transport radios quickly and quietly meant American units rarely suffered from the communication breakdowns that plagued German forces near the end of the war. A Jeep could carry signalmen to high ground, deliver spare radio parts, relocate antenna equipment, and maintain constant contact between widely spread units. German troops noted that American artillery seemed almost supernatural in how quickly it adjusted fire. The reason often came back to the Jeep. Forward observers rode them to frontline positions, sent coordinates instantly, and relocated before German counterfire could respond. This fluid communication system, powered by the Jeep's reliability, made American artillery deadlier and more accurate than what the Germans faced earlier in the war. Many German soldiers later admitted that they feared American artillery more than tanks, and the Jeep was one of the silent reasons for that fear. Fuel transport was another area where the Jeep demonstrated surprising effectiveness. German armored units suffered constant fuel shortages, often abandoning tanks simply because they could not obtain gasoline. American Jeeps, however, frequently carried multiple jerry cans strapped to their sides, enabling them to keep moving for long periods. They also played a vital role in refueling larger Allied vehicles on the front lines. When trucks couldn't reach forward positions due to enemy fire or rough terrain, jeeps made the journey instead, carrying enough fuel to keep tanks, half-tracks, and artillery tractors running. German soldiers were amazed at how American armored spearheads maintained momentum, and they later learned that the humble jeep was often the reason. It was the small vehicle that kept the big machines alive. Perhaps the role that Germans admired most was the jeep's adaptability. They witnessed jeeps being modified into makeshift gun platforms, with machine guns mounted on the front and rear. They saw jeeps outfitted with stretchers, radios, camouflage nets, snow plows, trailers, and even recoilless rifles. The Wehrmacht prided itself on engineering excellence, but their vehicles were rarely this adaptable. American mechanics could transform a jeep in minutes, turning it into whatever the situation required. German prisoners of war often spoke about how American vehicles are designed to change, a stark contrast to their own designs, which were optimized for specific roles and struggled outside them. All of these logistical strengths, supplying ammunition, transporting wounded, delivering orders, maintaining communication, refueling heavy vehicles, and adapting to any mission, made the jeep a force multiplier far greater than its size suggested. German soldiers came to understand that the jeep wasn't just a machine, it was a system, a backbone that carried the American army forward even when conditions should have halted movement altogether. In the eyes of many Germans, it was this little vehicle, more than tanks or planes, that truly embodied the American approach to warfare, simple, fast, flexible, and relentless. And in the end, they admired the jeep not because it was perfect, but because it performed every task with a reliability that the German war machine could no longer match. German soldiers, especially tank crews and reconnaissance units, were often stunned to see how effectively the Americans used the jeep as a fast-moving eyes-and-ears platform. In a battlefield dominated by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, the jeep seemed like the least important vehicle, yet in practice, it acted like a battlefield scout with almost supernatural awareness. German commanders frequently relied on armored cars or motorcycles for reconnaissance, both of which required stable roads and careful maneuvering. But the jeep behaved like it ignored the rules entirely. It raced down narrow forest paths, bounced across plowed fields, and slipped through ravines where German vehicles dared not go. Whenever Germans believed they had concealed their positions, it was usually a jeep, not a plane, not a tank, that found them first. The vehicle's speed, low profile, and surprisingly quiet engine made it an ideal reconnaissance tool, enabling American units to gather information before the Germans even realized they had been spotted. What shocked German scouts most was how deeply the jeep penetrated into contested territory. Motorcycle scouts had to slow down for mud, grass, or uneven ground, but jeeps seemed unwilling to stop for anything. They could climb embankments, weave through trees, and dash across streams with little hesitation. German forward observers often reported seeing one or two jeeps suddenly appear on a ridge, observe their positions, and vanish before a single shot could be fired. That level of speed and mobility made it difficult for German units to predict American movements. They often felt as if the Americans had an invisible network of scouts spread across the landscape, constantly feeding information to the rear. In reality, that network was often just a handful of jeeps operating with confidence and precision. German soldiers also noticed that the Americans paired jeeps with radios far more effectively than the Wehrmacht did with similar vehicles. In many cases, jeeps carried powerful radio sets that allowed them to communicate instantly with artillery commanders, infantry officers, and even air support. German scouts usually had to relay information in stages, passing messages from unit to unit until they reached headquarters. This process created delays at crucial moments. Meanwhile, a jeep scout could radio the exact coordinates of a German machine gun nest, mortar team, or armored platoon directly to artillery units several kilometers away. Minutes later, German soldiers would find themselves under a barrage of sudden, terrifyingly accurate fire. Some German troops later said it felt like the jeep was guiding the artillery shells with invisible strings. Even more unsettling was how the jeep allowed American commanders to maintain constant battlefield awareness. German officers were usually confined to armored command vehicles or had to climb observation posts, both of which were easy targets. American officers simply climbed into a jeep and drove to the front. They could inspect positions, check on infantry progress, and adjust tactics in real time. Germans frequently observed American officers standing in their jeeps with binoculars, issuing orders through radios while shells burst in the distance. That type of mobility gave the Americans something invaluable: real-time leadership. It meant decisions on the American side could be made swiftly, with first-hand knowledge of what was happening, while German officers often had to rely on delayed reports. Another role that demonstrated the jeep's reconnaissance value was its use by forward air controllers. German units were accustomed to their own sophisticated forward observer teams, but the Americans took the idea further by integrating jeeps directly with air operations. Jeeps fitted with radios and aerial markers coordinated air strikes, often driving dangerously close to German lines to identify targets for P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and B-26 bombers. German soldiers frequently complained that American air support reacted with impossible speed, as if aircraft were waiting just beyond the clouds. They didn't know that a jeep, hidden behind a hedgerow or perched on a hilltop, was sending precise updates the moment German armor or artillery shifted positions. The combination of jeep mobility and air power created a deadly synergy that made German movement incredibly risky. The jeep also played a key role in deception and counter-reconnaissance. Germans noted that American units often used jeeps to create false impressions of movement. A single jeep could drive along a road kicking up dust, making it look like a convoy was advancing. In forested terrain, jeeps would rapidly shuttle soldiers between positions, causing German observers to overestimate the number of American troops in the area. At night, jeeps equipped with blackout lights slipped behind German lines, dropping small patrols who sabotaged supply routes or gathered intelligence. German officers were puzzled by how often their rear areas were compromised, not realizing that jeeps had been quietly ferrying infiltration teams through the darkness. Germans also admired the bravery of jeep reconnaissance teams. Reconnaissance was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. Scouts operated ahead of the main force, often exposed with little protection. Yet American jeep crews drove straight into uncertainty with remarkable confidence. They relied on the jeep's agility rather than armor for survival. If German soldiers opened fire, the jeep didn't try to fight, it simply vanished with shocking speed. German troops frequently compared firing at jeeps to trying to hit rabbits darting across a field. This evasive agility made it incredibly difficult for German marksmen or gunners to land hits, especially at long range. Even machine gun bursts often kicked up dirt behind the jeep as it bounced away. Captured German soldiers sometimes spoke with admiration about how the jeep turned reconnaissance into a fluid, fast-paced exercise instead of the slow, methodical process they were accustomed to. German reconnaissance relied on precision and careful planning. The Americans relied on speed and adaptability. The jeep embodied that philosophy perfectly. It allowed American units to take risks, gather intelligence quickly, and make bold tactical decisions based on real-time information. The speed of American tactical adaptation was one of the reasons German forces felt overwhelmed in the final years of the war, and the jeep was a hidden but crucial factor behind that dynamism. In many post-war interrogations, German officers admitted that the jeep had reshaped the way they viewed battlefield awareness. It wasn't a tank that dominated the battlefield, nor an aircraft that broke their defenses. It was a small, unarmored vehicle that acted as a messenger, scout, command center, and air coordination tool. The jeep gave the Americans eyes everywhere and allowed them to respond to situations faster than the Germans could. In the end, the Germans didn't admire the jeep for its strength, but for its intelligence, its ability to deliver information, establish communication, and give American forces the strategic upper hand in almost every battle. To them, it was the quiet mastermind of the Allied advance, the little machine that guided the bigger ones toward victory. German soldiers were often stunned by how the jeep survived punishment that should have destroyed it. On the battlefield, machines usually broke before men did. Tracks snapped, wheels bent, engines overheated, transmissions failed, and electrical systems short-circuited. But the American jeep behaved like it didn't know the meaning of failure. Even when riddled with bullet holes, covered in mud, or pushed far beyond its intended limits, the Jeep kept running with a stubborn determination that impressed even its enemies. German troops prided themselves on precise engineering, but many admitted that German vehicles were too delicate for frontline chaos. They required care, maintenance, and clean conditions. The Jeep, on the other hand, tolerated abuse that would have crippled most German designs. Soldiers described seeing Jeeps run with damaged tires, leaking radiators, bent frames, and sometimes even missing body panels, yet still delivering troops and supplies as if nothing had happened. It was this almost animal-like toughness that earned the respect of frontline German troops. One of the first things Germans noticed was how simple the Jeep's engine was. Its design lacked the complexity of German engines, which relied on high-precision components that needed clean fuel and ideal conditions. The Jeep's four-cylinder, Go Devil engine, however, ran even when dirty, overheated, or partially damaged. German mechanics who inspected captured Jeeps were shocked by how quickly the engine could be repaired. A few bolts, a handful of tools, and a basic understanding of mechanics were enough to get it running again. Unlike German vehicles, which needed specific parts and delicate adjustments, Jeep repairs could be improvised. American soldiers were known to fix broken Jeeps using spare wire, scrap metal, or salvaged parts from wrecked vehicles. Germans were accustomed to their vehicles being unusable if even one component failed. Seeing Americans repair a Jeep in minutes, sometimes under fire, left a lasting impression. The Jeep's suspension system also contributed to its durability. German vehicles often needed smooth roads or stable ground to avoid damaging their complex systems, but the Jeep bounced over rocks, rolled through craters, and climbed rubble without harming its structure. Its leaf spring suspension gave it flexibility, allowing it to endure brutal impacts that would have snapped the axles of heavier vehicles. Many German soldiers recalled seeing Jeeps descending steep terrain at reckless angles, the wheels slamming against the earth, yet the vehicle continued unfazed. This ability to absorb punishment made the Jeep a reliable companion in places where German vehicles broke down simply because the ground was too harsh. Another aspect that amazed German troops was the Jeep's resistance to mud and freezing temperatures. The Eastern Front had taught the Germans how unforgiving winter could be. Engines froze, batteries died, and transmissions cracked under the strain. Even in Western Europe, during the Battle of the Bulge, German vehicles struggled as temperatures dropped. But Jeeps continued to start, run, and climb through snowbanks with tire chains and grit. American crews routinely poured warm water over frozen engines or used small fires to thaw vital components, simple solutions that worked because the Jeep's design allowed for it. Germans found themselves wondering why their own vehicles, with all their engineering brilliance, could not match the rugged practicality of such a small machine. Bullet resistance was another surprising feature. While the Jeep had no armor, its small size and open frame made it hard to destroy. Bullets often passed through harmlessly, hitting nothing important. German soldiers noticed that the Jeep's engine and fuel tank were positioned in ways that reduced catastrophic damage. This didn't make the Jeep safe, far from it, but it did make it durable in a strange way. A German truck hit by machine gun fire might catch fire or stop entirely. A Jeep, even with bullet holes across its body, usually kept moving. Germans joked grimly that the Jeep survived by refusing to give the enemy anything solid to hit. Its low silhouette and narrow profile made it a difficult target, and even when struck, it simply absorbed the damage and continued on. The Jeep's electrical system also impressed German mechanics. Where German vehicles often suffered from wiring issues when exposed to rain, mud, or constant vibration, the Jeep's wiring was simple, reliable, and easy to replace. American soldiers carried spare fuses, wires, and connectors, enabling them to restore electrical function on the spot. Germans often struggled with electrical faults in their vehicles, especially late-war models built with inferior materials. The Jeep, by comparison, seemed indifferent to the elements. Its headlights, ignition system, and radio equipment functioned reliably under conditions that crippled German machines. The Jeep's frame, too, demonstrated remarkable strength. Built with a sturdy chassis that distributed weight evenly, it resisted bending even when carrying heavy loads or towing trailers far above its recommended capacity. German soldiers watched jeeps haul artillery pieces, transport wounded men, pull vehicles out of ditches, and carry mountains of equipment without cracking their frames. German designs were often optimized for specific tasks: tanks for combat, trucks for supply, motorcycles for scouting. But the Jeep could do almost everything without structurally failing. Its simplicity made it strong, and its strength made it indispensable. Perhaps the most impressive display of Jeep durability came during retreats or sudden pushes. German units noticed that when Americans were forced to move rapidly, whether advancing or withdrawing, the Jeep was always the last vehicle to break and the first to get moving again. Even when damaged, it could be patched enough to roll. German vehicles abandoned during retreats often sat on the roadside, victims of broken transmissions or engine failures. But American Jeeps, even those battered by previous engagements, kept up with the pace of war. They were reliable under stress in a way that German vehicles, especially late-war models, simply could not match. Germans frequently remarked on how the Jeep created a sense of confidence among American troops. When soldiers trust their equipment to work no matter what, they fight with greater mobility and aggression. This morale advantage became a subtle but powerful factor. German officers noted that American infantry could rely on jeeps to deliver ammunition, evacuate wounded, and bring reinforcements, even in terrible conditions. Meanwhile, German units often found themselves stranded or forced to fight without logistical support because their vehicles broke down. The contrast was painful and undeniable. In the end, it was the Jeep's ruggedness, more than speed, more than versatility, more than engineering, that earned German admiration. It was a machine designed for survival, for endurance, for the unpredictable cruelty of war. German soldiers respected it because it represented something they lacked in the final years of the conflict: reliability. The Jeep didn't win battles alone, but it made victory possible by refusing to fail. And in the eyes of many Germans who fought against it, that stubborn durability made it one of the most effective Allied vehicles of the war. As dawn crept over the horizon, the exhausted German reconnaissance units pushed deeper into terrain they believed was secure, unaware that the small American Jeep lurking just beyond their line of sight had already rewritten the course of the morning. The growing desperation among German officers was becoming visible. They were running out of options, out of mobility, and out of surprises. Every advance they attempted seemed to be countered not by heavy tanks or overwhelming artillery, but by an agile little machine that appeared in places no vehicle had any right to be. In town squares, muddy fields, rocky slopes, and dense pine forests, German patrols kept reporting the same strange pattern: sightings of an American Jeep popping up where no truck or armored car could possibly reach. At first, commanders dismissed these reports as exaggerations, but soon the evidence became impossible to ignore. Tracks left behind in impossible terrain, ambush positions that could only be reached by something nimble and fast, and prisoners who admitted they had been captured by American crews operating with surprising speed. To a German officer trained in strict doctrine and methodical maneuver, this kind of fluid mobility was unnerving, almost unnatural, and it began to shape their understanding of just how dangerous the Jeep truly was. Over and over, soldiers found themselves facing hit-and-run attacks that disrupted supply columns, cut communication lines, and even disoriented entire infantry companies who relied on rigid marching formations. The Jeep did not fight like a tank or a truck, it fought like an extension of the soldiers riding it, turning the battlefield into a three-dimensional chessboard where speed replaced armor and surprise replaced firepower. German troops, who were used to vehicles with strict performance limits, soon realized that the Americans had blurred the boundaries between infantry and mechanized mobility in a way they had never anticipated. The miscalculations began piling up quickly. A German unit that expected a slow American advance would suddenly find itself flanked by a pair of jeeps carrying scouts with radios who were already relaying coordinates for artillery fire. A command post that believed it was safe behind a wooded ridge would suddenly be harassed by machine gun bursts from a jeep crew that had climbed the ridge using a narrow goat trail the Germans assumed was impassable. Convoys that normally protected themselves against tanks by avoiding open ground discovered that the real danger came from fast-moving jeep teams weaving through tree lines and firing before the Germans even saw them. The psychological impact was immense. Instead of fearing heavy armor, German soldiers began glancing nervously at every dirt path or forest gap, wondering if a jeep would burst through. Captured diaries from German corporals and lieutenants repeatedly mentioned how the small American car seemed capable of appearing from nowhere, striking, and disappearing before the Germans could properly respond. This was the opposite of how war machines normally behaved. Tanks announced their presence with thunderous engines, trucks followed predictable roads, motorcycles struggled with rough terrain, but the jeep seemed to defy all categories, performing the tasks of all three without the limitations of any of them. And while German troops admired the mechanical brilliance of the vehicle, what truly shocked them was the confidence it gave to American soldiers. They drove it aggressively, fearlessly, using the vehicle as a natural extension of their offensive doctrine. Jeep crews darted across fields under fire, carried vital messages through enemy lines, evacuated wounded under impossible conditions, and inserted reconnaissance teams into positions where even German motorcycles would hesitate to go. That level of mobility allowed the Americans to reshape battlefields in ways German tactics were not designed to counter. The Wehrmacht, though highly trained, relied heavily on logistics, fuel, and well-defined movement corridors. The jeep disrupted all three. Every time German commanders attempted to establish a defensive perimeter, jeeps slipped between gaps. Every time they tried to push forward, jeeps outran their scouts. Every time they attempted to set ambushes, the jeep's maneuverability allowed American units to bypass, evade, or counter-ambush positions entirely. And worst of all for the Germans, each jeep carried a radio, something even many German vehicles lacked at the platoon level. A jeep could spot, report, reposition, and guide artillery within minutes. In one documented case, a single Jeep scout team led an entire battalion's worth of artillery fire onto a German armored column simply by staying just out of sight and moving continuously from one vantage point to another. German tankers, trapped under raining shells they could not trace, wrote later that they never saw the Americans who targeted them, only the small dust clouds left behind by a Jeep fleeing into the trees. By midday, German commanders finally understood that the Jeep wasn't merely a transport vehicle. It was a battlefield multiplier, a silent, persistent force that reshaped the rhythm of every engagement. What they admired most, ironically, was not simply the machine itself, but the way the Americans used it. In German doctrine, a vehicle was part of a rigid structure. For the Americans, the Jeep was liberation, a tool that allowed even low-ranking soldiers to make rapid decisions, adjust movements, and act independently without waiting for orders. This decentralization stunned the Germans, who traditionally operated under strict hierarchical command. They recognized that the Jeep made American forces unpredictable, fast, and adaptable. The machine's noise grew into a symbol of shifting battle lines, and many German units came to view the Jeep as more dangerous than heavier vehicles because it led to situations where they were outmaneuvered before they even realized they were engaged. By evening, as shadows lengthened across the fields and the last echoes of skirmishes faded, German soldiers at every level found themselves discussing the same subject: how such a small, unarmored vehicle had managed to pose such a formidable threat. Some spoke of it with frustration, others with caution, but many with genuine admiration. The Jeep, to them, embodied American ingenuity, simple, rugged, fast, and always where you least expected it. And in that realization came a sobering truth: they were not just fighting the American army, they were fighting a new kind of mobility, a new kind of warfare, and a machine that had redefined what was possible on the battlefield. As the German columns regrouped and attempted to reorganize their scattered positions, a growing realization began to settle like dust on every soldier's uniform: the American Jeep was not just a supporting machine, it was the quiet architect behind their mounting confusion. By late afternoon, the once structured German formations had dissolved into pockets of resistance, each unsure of the other's location, each haunted by the possibility that a Jeep had already slipped behind them, observed them, and relayed their position to artillery or infantry lurking nearby. The chaos was subtle, almost invisible, but devastating. Reports flowed into German command posts describing strange, rapid movements by small American teams who seemed to travel impossibly fast across broken terrain and reappear in places no enemy vehicle should have been able to reach in such short time. What unnerved the Germans most was the fluidity with which these jeeps coordinated. One moment a jeep would be seen darting across a ridge, and minutes later artillery shells would fall precisely where it had come from. Then the jeep would reappear on an entirely different flank, kicking up dust as it raced past tree lanes the Germans thought were secure. It felt as if the Americans had multiplied themselves, as if these agile machines allowed a small force to impersonate an army. The Germans had spent years perfecting blitzkrieg, fast, coordinated, overwhelming mechanized warfare. But now, ironically, they were on the receiving end of a miniature version of their own doctrine, executed not by tanks or armored divisions, but by a small, open-top vehicle weighing barely a ton. It was humiliating and fascinating at the same time. Commanders who had once led panzers across France and Poland now found themselves outmaneuvered by a machine that looked almost like a toy beside their massive armored beasts. But it was the jeep's instincts, human instincts, that made it so lethal. American crews didn't hesitate, they dashed into hot zones, grabbed intelligence, evacuated wounded, and vanished before German countermeasures materialized. They treated the battlefield like a living organism, moving through its arteries with speed that defied doctrine. The Germans, who relied on predictability and structured movement, couldn't keep up with this unpredictability. Every time they believed they had mapped American positions, a jeep would slip through the cracks and redraw the map entirely. What made the situation worse for the Germans was their own lack of equivalent mobility. Their Kübelwagens were fine on roads but struggled in mud. Their motorcycles were fast but fell apart in rough terrain. Their larger vehicles were too heavy, too rigid, too dependent on established routes. The jeep, however, had no such limitations. It climbed slopes that defied engineering logic, floated over soft ground that trapped German trucks, and crossed streams that immobilized enemy vehicles. And because it was small, almost deceptively so, it could hide in places a German soldier would never think to look, behind a fallen tree, inside a bomb crater, beneath thick bushes, even between the charred husks of destroyed armor. From these concealed positions, jeep crews observed everything. They became the eyes of the American advance, turning every German mistake into an opportunity. A misplaced flank, a blind bend, a stalled convoy, nothing escaped the attention of these scouts. And once spotted, the Germans rarely had more than minutes before firepower descended upon them. But perhaps the greatest psychological blow to the Germans came from the jeep's adaptability. The same vehicle that carried radio operators in the morning could carry a mounted .50 caliber machine gun by noon. The jeep that transported wounded soldiers could, an hour later, lead a lightning reconnaissance push behind German lines. And because they required little fuel, little maintenance, and virtually no preparation to deploy, the Americans used them constantly, relentlessly. To German infantrymen, the jeep became a symbol of American persistence, appearing again and again, like a recurring vision that refused to fade. It wasn't armored, yet it refused to die. It wasn't built for combat, yet it shaped every engagement. And despite its size, it somehow managed to intimidate entire platoons who could never predict what information it had already gathered or what strike it had just coordinated. By sunset, German positions resembled a fractured puzzle. Officers barked orders into their radios, many of which malfunctioned or lacked range, trying desperately to locate units that were now separated by miles of terrain and uncertainty. Yet the Americans, thanks to their jeeps, operated with an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield. They knew where the Germans were weakest, where gaps had opened, where reinforcements were attempting to move. And every time the Germans tried to consolidate, the jeeps returned like ghosts, slicing through the perimeter, observing, withdrawing, and returning with reinforcements or fire support that shattered whatever cohesion the Germans had attempted to rebuild. Some German soldiers found themselves discussing the jeep in whispered tones, as if speaking too loudly might summon it. They respected it, not because it was powerful, but because it was everywhere. Diaries recovered after the war revealed descriptions of the vehicle as the American Shadow, the Silent Messenger, and the Four-Wheeled Phantom. These weren't exaggerations, they were the honest reflections of soldiers who had spent an entire day being outsmarted, outpaced, and outfought by a machine that seemed to break every rule of mechanized warfare. In a conflict defined by massive armored clashes and technological advancements, the Germans found themselves humbled by a simple, durable, brilliantly engineered vehicle that excelled not through force, but through freedom of movement. As darkness finally settled, the Germans realized something they would never forget: the Jeep was not merely transportation, it was a weapon of mobility, information, speed, and surprise. And in this evolving battlefield, where adaptability mattered more than size, it was the Americans, not the Germans, who now understood the future of warfare. Though heavily outgunned in some areas, the U.S. forces had mastered the art of turning mobility into dominance, and it was the Jeep that made that possible. As the night fell over Bastogne, the American defenders did not pause. Darkness, often considered an ally to attackers, became a stage for continuous offensive action. Patrols moved silently through the snow-laden streets, breaking through German observation posts, ambushing supply columns, and intercepting reconnaissance parties before they could report back. Every movement was calculated but executed with speed and decisiveness, reflecting the doctrinal training instilled over years under Marshall's vision. The 101st Airborne had been briefed on the principle that defense was never passive, it was always a temporary stance designed to set the stage for an immediate counterattack. Soldiers moved in teams, supporting each other with covering fire, grenades, and improvised demolitions. The cold wind stung their faces, snow crunching underfoot, but the men acted as if nothing could slow them. The Germans, expecting a subdued, demoralized force that would cling to its perimeter and conserve ammunition, were repeatedly surprised by the relentless activity. Even the smallest American squads displayed remarkable initiative. A single lieutenant could detect a weakly held position and coordinate a rapid assault using all available assets, from artillery to mortars to the handful of tanks they possessed. The Germans had superior numbers, but the Americans had decisiveness, and decisiveness multiplied by mobility and aggression often overcame raw numerical advantage. In every sector of Bastogne, the principle remained the same: act immediately and relentlessly. Engineers reinforced positions while simultaneously preparing demolition traps for incoming enemy armor. Artillery units fired mission orders almost autonomously, adjusting rapidly to troop reports that came in from front lines. Commanders at every level understood that waiting would be fatal. This decentralized decision-making created a dynamic environment where every soldier could contribute to offensive operations without needing explicit orders from higher headquarters. A sergeant spotting German engineers laying charges on American supply routes could decide instantly whether to assault, destroy, or ambush. A private could man a machine gun in a seemingly exposed location not for defense alone but as a means to control the surrounding terrain and facilitate rapid counterattacks. Every act, no matter how small, reinforced the doctrine: seize the initiative, disrupt the enemy, exploit the moment. By late night, German attempts to penetrate the perimeter had become increasingly chaotic. Commanders tried to coordinate reinforcements and armor strikes, but every movement was shadowed by American scouts and jeeps that darted through snow-draped streets, observing, reporting, and striking unpredictably. Vehicles and soldiers that were meant to converge at strategic points suddenly found themselves under ambush or artillery fire they had no time to avoid. The cumulative effect was staggering. German formations, expecting the Americans to react slowly, found their planning rendered useless by a combination of speed, initiative, and audacity. Even at the highest levels of command, American doctrine was apparent. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, whose famous "nuts" response had become symbolic of Bastogne's resilience, continued to coordinate operations without hesitating for perfect intelligence. Each new piece of information was assessed quickly, decisions were issued to subordinate officers, and action followed immediately. There was no room for doubt. This culture of action extended beyond the officers to every enlisted soldier, reflecting the training regime that stressed decision-making under pressure and aggressive offense from day one. The Germans had superior tanks and artillery, but they were slow to adapt to the fluid American tactics. Every time a German division tried to establish a foothold, American troops counterattacked before positions could be consolidated. Every street corner, building, or crossroads that the Germans attempted to occupy became a site of fierce contest. The 327th Glider Infantry, often outnumbered, conducted raids into German flanks, seizing control of key supply lines and observation posts. Small units would simultaneously defend their positions and project offensive force outward, maintaining a constant state of pressure. The Germans could not rest, could not reorganize, and could not predict where the next assault would hit. Exhaustion began to seep into German ranks, and uncertainty became as dangerous as American firepower. Supplies, logistics, and communication also demonstrated the effectiveness of American doctrine. Despite being surrounded, supply convoys managed to break through narrow corridors thanks to meticulous planning, timing, and the aggressive escorting of armored vehicles and jeeps. Medicine, ammunition, and reinforcements flowed directly into sectors where counterattacks were already underway. Communications between infantry, armor, and artillery were maintained with remarkable efficiency despite the chaos, often relying on improvisation and initiative rather than rigid adherence to procedure. German commanders, witnessing their meticulous plans unravel, repeatedly noted in reports how American responsiveness created a sense of perpetual operational surprise. By December 23, even the most determined German probes had been repelled, often with significant losses. Each failed attempt reinforced the Americans' momentum, boosting morale while simultaneously demoralizing the attackers. The psychology of unceasing offense began to dominate the battlefield. German soldiers began to retreat from positions they initially considered advantageous, wary that any delay could be met by swift American retaliation. Perhaps the most striking demonstration of American doctrine was the interplay between artillery and small unit action. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, operating with near-autonomous authority, shifted fire rapidly in support of counterattacking infantry units. They did not wait for orders from a central command. When infantry units reported enemy concentrations, artillery immediately engaged, even at perilously close distances to American positions. The doctrine accepted the risk of friendly fire over the risk of giving the Germans the opportunity to consolidate. This aggressive integration of arms reflected decades of doctrinal evolution, the careful studies of General George Marshall, and the rigorous practical training of officers who had passed through Fort Benning. Coordination was constant, rapid, and effective. Tanks engaged enemy armor preemptively, engineers disrupted enemy positions, infantry assaulted with full aggression, and artillery fired in a synchronized dance that never paused for bureaucracy or overcautious deliberation. Even in the midst of siege conditions, the American forces displayed the offensive mindset that had been embedded at every level, from private to general. By the time reinforcements from General Patton's Third Army began reaching Bastogne, the Americans had already turned a desperate defensive situation into a controlled battlefield of opportunity. Entire German columns had been slowed, fragmented, or destroyed, not merely by numbers or firepower, but by relentless initiative and continuous action. The relief did not signal the end of American aggression, it marked the transition from defensive counteraction to full offensive expansion, demonstrating the seamless adaptability of their doctrine. The German Ardennes offensive, initially designed to break Allied lines in a rapid, coordinated strike, now faced an unstoppable, aggressive, and deeply adaptive enemy. By December 27, American forces were pressing forward, exploiting gaps, reclaiming lost ground, and inflicting significant operational setbacks on the enemy. The siege of Bastogne had become a textbook demonstration of what happens when doctrine, training, initiative, and audacity converge. Small units that had once been under siege now dictated the tempo, while higher-level command coordinated complex maneuvers with unprecedented speed. The doctrine that had been cultivated over decades, tested in North Africa, and refined through Sicily and Italy, proved decisive in a single, desperate Belgian town. Bastogne was not won by chance. It was won by discipline, by foresight, and by the continuous, unyielding offensive spirit that defined the American army. By the early days of January, the tide of the Ardennes campaign had visibly shifted, and Bastogne had become the linchpin of American resilience. The Germans, who had anticipated an easy capture of the town and hoped to exploit the momentum to advance rapidly, were now contending with a network of American positions that seemed to anticipate every maneuver. Soldiers, from privates to sergeants, moved with a keen awareness of terrain, temperature, and timing, all integrated into the overarching doctrine that emphasized offensive action even when ostensibly on the defensive. The harsh winter imposed challenges that would have crippled lesser-trained armies. Roads were ice-coated, visibility was minimal, and supply lines were strained. Yet the Americans used these conditions to their advantage, converting frozen rivers and snow-laden forests into natural barriers and channels that funneled German forces into predictable patterns. Scouts in jeeps and snow-adapted vehicles moved constantly, observing, reporting, and striking with a precision that seemed to defy the chaos of the battlefield. Each sector of Bastogne was effectively an operational node, capable of initiating its own counterattack, artillery strike, or reconnaissance mission with minimal centralized instruction, reflecting a culture of initiative ingrained in every soldier. Every engagement during this period reinforced the American doctrine of aggressive action. A single German reconnaissance squad would stumble into a prepared American ambush, resulting in rapid casualties and disarray far beyond the initial contact. Infantry units simultaneously defended critical junctions and projected power into enemy-held areas, often outmaneuvering numerically superior German forces through speed, coordination, and adaptive use of terrain. Artillery units, positioned strategically around the town, shifted fire with fluidity, hitting German columns before they could regroup, often within minutes of receiving reports. The Germans, accustomed to more rigid command hierarchies, struggled to respond with equal agility. Each failure compounded the previous, eroding confidence and sapping momentum. Even when German armored vehicles attempted to penetrate Bastogne's perimeter, engineers and infantry acted in tandem to lay traps, create obstacles, and coordinate direct counterattacks, blending defensive preparation seamlessly with offensive initiative. The doctrine that emphasized action over hesitation meant that no ground could be assumed safe, and every German advance carried inherent risk, often turning the aggressor into the victim. The psychological dimension of the battle became increasingly significant. German soldiers, facing relentless counterattacks, unpredictable ambushes, and a persistent, almost omnipresent enemy, experienced mounting frustration and fear. Morale eroded faster than physical losses could justify, highlighting how doctrinal principles extend beyond tactics to influence perception and cohesion. Conversely, American troops drew confidence from constant success, even in the face of extreme cold and limited resources. Each small victory, repelling a patrol, seizing an advantageous ridge, intercepting supplies, created a cascading effect on morale, reinforcing the mindset that initiative and rapid decision-making could overcome any obstacle. Commanders at all levels fostered this environment deliberately, encouraging soldiers to act independently when situations demanded, creating a dynamic, fluid battlefield where the enemy could not anticipate responses. The culture of initiative transformed Bastogne from a besieged town into a hub of operational control, with American forces dictating the tempo of the campaign despite being surrounded. Logistics and communication, often Achilles' heels in winter campaigns, became instruments of tactical superiority. Supply convoys, escorted by armored vehicles and scouts, navigated frozen roads under constant threat of German interdiction, but ingenuity and speed ensured that critical munitions, medicine, and reinforcements reached frontline units without delay. Field telephone lines were maintained under fire, runners navigated ice and snow to deliver orders, and signals units improvised when standard channels failed. This redundancy and adaptability allowed American forces to operate as a cohesive entity while retaining the flexibility for decentralized initiative. In effect, the doctrine transformed logistical limitations into tactical advantages. Germans expected delays and confusion, but instead encountered continuous, coordinated action at every level. Small units could engage, withdraw, and reinforce without waiting for centralized command, and artillery and armor were able to respond rapidly to fleeting opportunities, magnifying the impact of every engagement. American mastery of terrain and mobility became increasingly evident. Forested ridges, frozen rivers, and narrow roads were leveraged to channel German movements into predictable corridors, where ambushes, indirect fire, and armored engagements were most effective. Jeep-mounted patrols, often scouting ahead or flanking enemy columns, became symbols of this doctrine in action. They struck with speed, relayed real-time intelligence, and forced the enemy into reactionary postures, disrupting cohesion and initiative. Engineers simultaneously repaired damaged roads and prepared explosive obstacles, ensuring that the Germans could neither advance nor retreat without risk. This interplay between offense, mobility, and adaptation reflected decades of doctrinal refinement and the careful cultivation of initiative across all ranks. Every soldier understood that the measure of effectiveness was not merely survival but the ability to act decisively, disrupt enemy plans, and seize fleeting opportunities. Bastogne was no longer just a defensive position, it had become a hub of relentless operational activity, where action dictated outcomes and hesitation guaranteed failure. By mid-January, the cumulative effects of American doctrine were starkly evident. German units, exhausted and demoralized, were increasingly vulnerable to both frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers. American troops exploited every weakness, often acting ahead of explicit orders, while artillery and armor reinforced the operational tempo. The Germans' numerical advantage was negated by the Americans' relentless, coordinated, and decentralized approach. Soldiers moved as a unified organism, each contributing to a continuous cycle of observation, reporting, striking, and consolidating gains. Supply lines remained open, morale stayed high, and the initiative remained firmly in American hands. The result was not merely tactical victory but operational mastery, where the principles of doctrine, training, and initiative coalesced into decisive influence over the battlefield. Bastogne, once expected to fall in days, had become a monument to the efficacy of action-oriented doctrine and adaptive leadership. The battle concluded with the German offensive in the Ardennes effectively neutralized in the Bastogne sector. American forces, through unyielding initiative, aggressive action, and precise integration of infantry, artillery, and armor, had transformed a precarious defensive situation into an operational success that shaped the broader campaign. The principles demonstrated, initiative, rapid decision-making, aggressive counteraction, and adaptive use of terrain, underscored why American doctrine, honed through years of rigorous training and practical combat experience, could overcome superior enemy numbers, harsh winter conditions, and intense operational pressure. Bastogne would remain a textbook example of how doctrine, discipline, and initiative combined to produce decisive results, shaping the narrative of the Ardennes and setting enduring lessons for future military strategy. As January deepened, the battle for Bastogne had evolved from mere survival into a showcase of American operational mastery, where doctrine, initiative, and relentless action converged to define the outcome. Every American unit, from rifle squads to armored companies, had internalized the principles that emphasized aggression over passivity, mobility over inertia, and adaptability over rigid procedure. Even in the face of dwindling supplies, bitter cold, and constant enemy pressure, soldiers acted decisively, exploiting every opportunity the battlefield presented. Artillery observers, perched atop icy ridges, coordinated barrages that struck enemy formations before they could consolidate, while infantry units executed flanking maneuvers with surgical precision, often in synchronization with armored detachments navigating treacherous, snow-clogged roads. The Germans, accustomed to linear command structures and predictable operational tempos, found themselves repeatedly outpaced, outmaneuvered, and surprised. Each setback, compounded by the unforgiving winter, strained morale and diminished cohesion, while American forces continued to function as a dynamic, decentralized organism, where initiative at all levels dictated tempo and outcome. The intricate integration of mobility and firepower became increasingly apparent as small, jeep-mounted reconnaissance teams probed German positions, relayed intelligence, and executed rapid strikes. These units, operating ahead of main lines, disrupted enemy patrols, ambushed supply convoys, and created constant uncertainty within German command. The ability to act independently, yet cohesively with larger operational plans, reflected the core principle of initiative that defined American doctrine. Infantry and engineers simultaneously defended positions, laid traps, and facilitated armored counterattacks, ensuring that no advance went unchallenged. The frozen terrain, initially seen as an obstacle, was transformed into a strategic asset, channeling German movements into predictable avenues of approach where ambushes, artillery, and combined arms tactics could be applied with maximum effect. In this environment, hesitation proved fatal, while rapid, coordinated action generated disproportionate results, a reality demonstrated repeatedly during skirmishes and major engagements across the Bastogne sector. The psychological dimension of warfare played a pivotal role in these final stages. German soldiers, facing a seemingly omnipresent enemy capable of striking from unexpected directions, became increasingly cautious, hesitant, and demoralized. Every failed assault and disrupted convoy eroded confidence, reinforcing a perception of American omnipotence despite the harsh winter conditions. Conversely, American troops drew strength from continuous success, their confidence magnified by the visible effects of initiative, coordinated action, and rapid exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Leaders at all levels cultivated this mindset deliberately, fostering a culture where individual decision-making was valued, initiative was rewarded, and the momentum of action became a self-reinforcing cycle. The battlefield, once a chaotic and threatening space, became an arena in which Americans dictated terms, tempo, and engagement outcomes, a remarkable inversion of the typical dynamics of a besieged force. Logistics, often the silent arbiter of military success, was harnessed with ingenuity and precision. Supply convoys, despite exposure to enemy interdiction and treacherous winter roads, ensured that frontline units remained equipped with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel. Field communications, including lines, runners, and improvised signaling, allowed operational plans to be executed seamlessly across dispersed units, while artillery and armored commands adjusted fire and movement in real time based on rapidly changing circumstances. The flexibility inherent in American doctrine meant that decentralized units could act independently without losing cohesion, creating a persistent, multidirectional threat that constantly challenged German assumptions. Each logistical and operational success compounded the enemy's confusion, demonstrating how preparation, ingenuity, and adaptability could transform environmental challenges into decisive advantages. As German offensives faltered, American forces transitioned from reactive defense to proactive dominance. Infantry squads, supported by armor and artillery, seized key terrain, cut off retreating units, and prevented enemy regrouping. Commanders, empowered to act on emerging intelligence, orchestrated maneuvers that kept German forces off balance, turning momentum decisively in favor of the defenders. The battlefield became a fluid landscape, where rapid movement, decisive action, and adaptive tactics governed success. Even isolated units could strike effectively, supported by overlapping fields of fire, coordinated artillery, and mobile reserves, exemplifying a doctrine that fused initiative with operational depth. The cumulative effect was the erosion of German offensive capability, the stabilization of the American defensive line, and the creation of conditions favorable for counteroffensives beyond Bastogne. By the end of January, the strategic significance of Bastogne was fully realized. American forces had not only held the town but had effectively dictated the operational terms of engagement, transforming a besieged defensive position into a hub of initiative and control. The battle demonstrated the power of doctrine, emphasizing aggressive action, decentralized command, and adaptive use of terrain. German attempts to regain initiative were repeatedly foiled by rapid responses, coordinated maneuvering, and the seamless integration of infantry, armor, and artillery. Every skirmish, patrol, and counterattack reinforced the principle that momentum and initiative were decisive, turning perceived disadvantages, harsh weather, limited supplies, and numerical parity, into operational strengths. Bastogne became emblematic of American doctrine in practice, where trained, adaptable forces leveraging initiative and combined arms could overcome formidable challenges. In retrospect, Bastogne's defense illuminated enduring lessons in military strategy. Initiative at all levels, fluid integration of combined arms, and the transformation of environmental and logistical challenges into tactical advantages exemplified the doctrine that would shape future engagements. The battle underscored the importance of empowering soldiers to act decisively within the commander's intent, blending individual initiative with overarching operational objectives. As the Ardennes campaign concluded in this sector, Bastogne remained a testament to disciplined training, aggressive action, and adaptive leadership, providing a model for future operations in complex and hostile environments. The Americans' ability to dictate tempo, exploit terrain, and sustain relentless initiative demonstrated that the effective application of doctrine could turn adversity into decisive victory, leaving an indelible mark on the history of warfare.